Hey guys, today I'm going to give you a quick overview of pretty much all of the sliders and adjustments that you have in Lightroom in no more than 15 minutes. And while I'm doing that, I'm also going to show you how I edit this raw file live to this picture at the end. And this video is brought to you by Luminar, an amazing plugin with that you can edit your pictures even further after editing them already in Lightroom. Check out the link in the video description to learn more. Alright, so let's just jump into the first one, and that is the basics. Here you're gonna do all of your rudimentary adjustments, and it's a great way to start out. You can either bring up, down the exposure, you can add punch by bringing up the contrast, or go for a very artistic low contrast look. The highlight slider will adjust the very broad bright parts and either make them brighter or darker. I really like to bring that slider down by quite a bit to recover a lot of the highlight and cloud detail, and shadows is kind of like the same thing, just with the shadows and dark areas. Usually bringing them up works a lot better. Then whites is kind of similar to the highlights, but instead of adjusting everything very broadly in the bright parts, it will really just bring the very bright parts and kind of medium bright parts to the right and make them brighter, or to the left and make them darker. I really love to bring that up because it adds so much dynamic to the entire picture. And blacks is kind of like a very similar thing again to the whites, because it will adjust the medium dark blacks a lot more than the very broad ones that are adjusted by the shadow slider. In contrary to the white slider though, I prefer to bring that down quite a lot of the cases, although of course feel free to play around with. Color temperature, by bringing that to the left, you will make everything very blue and cold. To the right, you will make everything very warm and yellowish. Go with whatever you like best, because sometimes the neutral tones don't work really great. In sunset pictures, adding a lot of warmth might work better, and going for like a winter picture, then adding a bunch of blues might help with the mood. And here I'm just gonna go for like a neutral look. Tint is a very similar thing, except you can bring it to the left and make it more green, bring it to the right and make everything more magenta-ish. Bringing it to the right works especially well in sunset pictures and everything that is already very colorful, but in regular pictures you should probably just leave it where it was. Clarity will adjust your very crisp clarity, and bring it to the right will exaggerate all of the fine textures and really bring them out. This can be a very great thing if you really want to bring out the textures, such as I want in this photo. But again, if you have like a ton of texture that you don't really want to have pronounced, then going into the minus can work at least a little bit. And if you really want to go for an artistic look and, you know, make the background seem hazy, or perhaps you're in a winter picture and everything is kind of dreamy, then going into the minus can work. Although, generally speaking, you probably want to think about more going to the plus rather than to the minus, although you don't want to go too far. Vibrance and saturation will either bring up or bring down your entire saturation of the picture. Vibrance will look at the picture and do it more smartly by bringing up the colors that are not as prominent already in the picture more than the ones that are, and saturation will just kind of do it everything in a very broad and non-clever way, although a great combination of both sliders can work a lot of times. Going to step number 2, the tonal curve. Here you can adjust all of your sliders in terms of the exposure even more in detail. The highlight slider, and by the way, all of these sliders will just represent this area that you set previously. So the right of the tonal curve is of course the very bright areas, the left is the very dark areas. You can just click into the tonal curve and drag the bright parts down, and it will make everything darker in the highlight parts. Or you can do the same thing with the shadows and make them very bright, or just bring them up or bring them down and make everything very contrasty. You can also move around these little pinpointers which represent the sliders down here. By default, however, the highlight slider will adjust the very bright parts, so very different than the other sliders in the basics. Here it's really great if you want to have some additional dynamic and your sky is kind of dull and dark, you can bring that up. Or if your sky is very bright, or you just have some very bright parts that you want to have not quite as pronounced, then going a little bit into the minus can work quite well. Lights will do a very broad overall adjustment. Bring it up, of course, makes it brighter, bring it down, makes it darker, and darks is a very similar thing, just again with the dark parts. Shadows is the exact same thing as the highlights. By bringing it down, you will make the very dark parts and only the very dark parts darker. Bringing it up will just make the very dark parts a lot less just dark. So bringing it down can usually work a lot of times, especially if you have an overall low contrast picture, but you still want to have a hint of contrast. That way you will get that while not making your overall picture contrasty at all. Point curve, you can select between medium contrast and strong contrast here. This is a very fine and texture contrast, doesn't work a lot of times, but especially in black and white pictures it might be something to consider. And let's go to number 3, which is the HSL tool. Here you can adjust all of your hue, saturation and luminance, different colors. So you can either go into either of these sliders, and let's say, because there are so many greens, you can adjust your green tones. Here it's mostly a mixture of yellow actually, so you can make them either more towards the red tones or bring them more towards green tones. A great thing is also that you can just grab this little pinpointer, go over in a color, and then just hold down the left mouse click while sliding down or up your mouse, and that will adjust the color accordingly to how much there actually is in that part that you've selected. It's a great way to fine-tune the hue. Same is true with the saturation. If you just want to make an individual color a little bit more saturated or less saturated, that is a great way to balance everything out. And the luminance will just make an individual color very luminous and very bright or very dark. Don't go too far into either of these sliders, especially with the luminance, because then you might get artifacts and make it look very unnatural indeed. So going to step number 4, which is the split toning. And split toning will, in contrary to the basic saturation or any of the saturation or vibrances, it will not only exaggerate the color, but it will actually add new color. So you have 2 separate things here, which is highlights and shadows. Highlights is probably what you want to look for, and you can adjust this slider right here to adjust the hue and then the saturation of the chosen hue. But I prefer to just go into this little box, and then you can slide around and choose whatever color you want to add to your picture. In sunset pictures I oftentimes like to add some very warm tones, but you can of course go into the blues and kind of very artistic colors as well. For example, in this one I think I'm gonna go into a kind of blue tone, although not very much saturation at all, and the shadows will not really have such a big impact most of the time, because naturally speaking the colors always come from the highlights. I might go for kind of a light blue, although just with a little bit of saturation. Going into number 5 though, which is all of the detail stuff. Here you can really adjust your sharpening, your noise reduction and your color noise reduction. So for that I would suggest you to zoom in 1:1 to your picture so you actually see what you're doing, and by bringing up the sharpening you will make everything more sharp. It's a really nice slider to just add very basic and very broad sharpening. Now you can adjust the radius as well as the detail of it as well, although I would recommend you to adjust the amount more so than anything else. And masking slider is great. For that you want to zoom out again, hold down your Alt key and you can bring it to the right. Everything that is white is going to be sharpened, everything that is black is not going to be sharpened. The reason why you want to bring that to the right is because non-textured surfaces such as the sky don't really benefit from sharpening at all, because you will just introduce noise that way, since there are no structures to be sharpened. Noise reduction is something that you can use of course to get rid of noise, get rid of grain if you really have a ton. It also comes at a cost though, and that is it makes everything more plasticky, less sharp, less detailed. So I would suggest you to only be very selective and only add it if you really need to, and if you need to add some, then be very careful with the actual amount. Here as well you have some further adjustment options, but usually luminance itself does the job well. Color noise reduction is great, just bring that to the right to around 70 or 80. In contrary to noise reduction, it doesn't have a bad impact at all, but it will make your entire picture way more clean by removing the purple and green sensor noise, which is especially visible in the shadows. Here is from 0 color noise reduction, and here's about 85, and again it doesn't have a bad impact at all. And you can also further adjust this slider, but it isn't really necessary. Going to step number 6, which is the lens corrections. And of course lens corrections, the thing that you want to do here mostly is remove the chromatic aberration, so any of the purple and green fringing on the high contrast edges. So I click on this little box, it will get rid of that, and it does a great job usually. Enabling profile corrections is a great thing to also do. Just choose your lens, in this case a Canon 1855 kit lens. It will remove all of the distortion of the lens as well as the vignetting from the lens. You could go into manual and do all sorts of manual stuff, but it really isn't necessary most of the times. Going to step number 7, the transform. Here you can choose between off, auto, guided, where you can actually select your lines to straighten manually. you can go to level, vertical, and full. What this is meant for is mostly for architecture pictures, or if you would have kind of a lot of lines of houses that aren't super straight, this will usually take care of it beyond just the lens corrections. And if it doesn't work, you can even go into the sliders here manually. But again, this is mostly something to worry about for architecture pictures, and it's a great tool for that. But for landscape pictures and stuff like that, you don't really need it. Going to step number 8, which is the effects tool. So for the effects, you can first of all add vignetting either into the minus exposure or into the plus exposure. Plus exposure really doesn't work a lot of the times, but actually going into the minus exposure can work really quite a lot of the time. You can adjust your midpoint, which will adjust how big your vignetting actually is, your roundness, your feather, which determines the blending of the actual vignetting to the rest of the picture to try to smooth it then to the left. I would recommend you to bring that a little bit to the right, and highlights will determine how many of the highlights will shimmer through. Now, generally speaking, I like to add a little bit of vignetting. It can really work a lot of the times, but you don't want to go too far, and vignetting is a great thing to really add mood, but as well also add more attention towards the center of the picture. Here's before any vignetting and here is after. Grain is something that you can add if you want to have a vintage look, so it just makes your picture very grainy. Honestly, something that a lot of people want to remove, but you know, it's there. If you would really want to go for some super artistic vintage look, you have the option there. And dehaze is something, if you have a lot of haze in your picture or mist, then you can get rid of that by bringing it to the right. Be careful though, as it can really ruin the picture if you go too far to the right. You can also add it and use it as an artistic tool by going to the minus. Now, additionally to just removing or adding haze or mist, you can actually use that as a very fine form of contrast, because it is kind of a mixture between the contrast slider in the basics and the clarity slider in the basics as well. So here, for example, I think I'm actually going to add a little bit of dehaze, even though there's no haze. I just like it for the look. Going to the 9th and last global adjustment, which is the camera calibration. The profile is only something that you have the option to actually adjust if you're working with a RAW file, not with a JPEG file. But here you can go through all of them, and they will change your overall appearance, your hue, your color, your saturation. And I think it's really valuable to go through all of them real quick and see if there's something that you like better. Here in this case, there's nothing, but it can work a lot of the times. Going to the primary color sliders, adjusting any of these sliders will also adjust all of the other colors. So let's say you adjust the blues, it will also adjust the greens and the reds, because those are made of some amount of blue, so just be aware of that. It can be a great way to further fine-tune your entire color and really get the hue exactly where you want it to be, but also be careful because it can really mess up a picture quite well if you go too far into either direction. And with the last global adjustment, there are still some of the local adjustments which are very important and very valuable as well, but also the histogram. The histogram is a representation of your entire exposure, so the right represents all of the bright areas, the left all of the dark areas, the middle all of the areas in between, and by clicking on this little triangle on the top left and the top right, you will show exposure clipped warnings, meaning any areas that are completely black and don't contain any detail in them whatsoever will show in a very bright blue, and the same thing is true with the highlight. If something is just completely white and doesn't contain any detail anymore, it will just show in very bright red. Then down here you have your most important settings that you shot this picture with. Down here you have your array of local adjustments, but you also have red eye correction, which is something, if you have a portrait, you have somebody with a red eye from a flash, you can remove it here. Then spot removal tool, you can either go on clone or heal. I would generally suggest you do stay on heal, and with that, if you want to remove a dust or dirt spot, you can just do that. Usually speaking, you probably want to have your feather around 50, your opacity at 100, and your size according to the object that you want to remove. Then just click on it and it will remove and replace it with an area that fits. Sometimes you will have to right click and select new source a couple of times until Lightroom does a good job, but it's a great way to remove any unwanted blemishes or sensor or dirt spots. And also way to the left you would have your cropping overlay. Here you can crop your picture or just zoom in and also rotate it. Great way to just align your horizon as well. You can also use the angle tool and go over your horizon and just make a straight line over there. Although just be aware that if you crop, you will lose some of the detail, and depending on how much you crop, you might really end up with a very low quality picture at the end. It's always best to shoot in camera the best way you can. And by the way, you also have a wide array of presets right here. With that you can select different aspect ratios, for example 3:1 if you wish to do a panoramic aspect ratio. Now going into the actual local adjustments, you pretty much have three here, which is the graduated filters, your Radial filter, and your adjustment brush. First of all, let's go into the graduated filter, and with that you can add a filter to a side of a picture, and you can choose between all of these adjustments that will then only adjust this side. So as you can see with this crazy overdone example, I just make the sky very overly done, very dark. But you can also mix that with a whole bunch of different sliders. It's a great way, especially the graduated filter is a great way to adjust skies. For example here, I'm going to go a little bit into the minus exposure, plus contrast, probably plus whites as well, minus highlights, and then just make the minus shadows to make everything a little bit more contrasty and dramatic here in the sky. And while I'm at it, also add a bit of tint. Now clarity, why not also add a bit of that? And I think that makes the sky look a lot better. Here's from before that one graduated filter to after. And of course the sky adjustment is just one way you can use it. Personally in this photo, for example, I will also use it to decrease the exposure in the bottom of the picture. And also I'm gonna add another one to the left just to make that a little bit darker for additional mood and differentiation in the lighting. And speaking of differentiation in the lighting, another way that I really like to use the graduated filter for is to go over an entire side of a picture, have a very soft edge. So the edge is the amount to how soft you want to have your actual effect blend into the rest of the picture. By having it very soft, it will look very soft and natural. And you can also have it very dark and harsh if you have a very harsh horizon over the ocean or something, but generally speaking you want to have it more soft than not. And here again I'm gonna go a bit into the minus exposure for the entire left side, and then grab another one, a new one over the right side, and go into the exact opposite, into the plus exposure, although I don't want to go too far here. And that way, by doing that, I just have a lot more differentiation, a lot more complexity in the lighting. And I think I might even add a very last filter over the very top. And by the way, by holding shift you have a perfectly straight filter, and then you can go into the minus adjustment or whatever you're planning to do. So just to show you from before, any graduated filter to after really adds dynamic and mood. And of course you can always go back and adjust all of these filters separately if you think something was a little bit over the top. Now before I actually go into the Radial filter, I'm going to go into the adjustment brush. Adjustment brush is great to brush over something. So if you just want to have plus exposure like over a complex area that you cannot do with the graduated filter, then you probably want to use the adjustment brush for that. And you can enable auto mask that will just kind of let Lightroom choose what you want to have selected. It usually doesn't work that well, so I would recommend you to not use it at all. As you can see, this weird and ugly texture here, so just uncheck that. Then density is of course the density of the actual adjustment that you choose here. The flow is just kind of how smooth and natural looking everything is. Feather is again how soft is the blending in of the adjustment to the rest of the picture. Having a very low feather will just make it very unnatural looking as well. And size is of course just size. Now you can hold down the Alt key to minus adjustment brush and get rid of a previously added, adjustment over just an area, which is really great if you would just, for example, want to have kind of this hill selected and have it very bright for whatever reason, and you kind of spoiled, you can just press down the Alt key and get rid of that. And that's also a thing that I forgot to mention. If you have a graduated filter and you want to have your entire sky very dark, you can just add one over the sky. But then if you have like a house or whatever, you can go over the brush, press down the Alt key and get rid of an adjustment in an area. So that way you can still use the graduated filters, which are much faster and much more convenient than using the adjustment brush for everything. So then the Radial filters is pretty much the last thing that I'm going to cover here. And this is a really great thing because, especially for dodge and burning, you can of course use that to increase the exposure or decrease the exposure in local spots. Just be sure to invert the mask so the actual adjustment is just within the filter. You can of course also uncheck that if you, for example, just have a portrait and you want to make everything but the face darker. but in generally speaking, you probably want to invert the mask, and again, feather determines the actual amount of softness from the adjustment to the rest of the picture. I would recommend you to stick at around 100 for most general adjustments, and dodge and burning is of course making individual parts either darker or brighter for additional interest and dynamic. Now I like to add plus whites along with a little bit of plus exposure, bit of contrast as well as warmth, and then just go over certain parts of my picture. You can right click and duplicate, and then drag the duplicated filter over another area on your picture, and again, dodge and burning will just add a lot of complexity, a lot of interest, and I'd really like to use it that way. You can also use the Radial filter for all sorts of other things. For example, here I think I'm gonna go over the sky and just make the right part actually mix that with a little bit of plus exposure, so again there is more differentiation from one side to the other, but not go quite as far, maybe even into minus highlights so it doesn't blow everything, and then go a bit into the warmer colors so there's actually some color differentiation as well rather than just the exposure. And why not go into the color here as well and just add a bit of red, something like that. And you know, there's really a ton of opportunity for the Radial filters, and I would really suggest you to take a closer look at them because they can change up your picture quite a lot. And with that, I'm actually done with explaining pretty much everything that you have in the develop tool in terms of editing sliders and adjustments. But before I end this video, I want to mention Luminar again, which is an amazing plugin. Now, they're sponsoring this video, so of course I'm gonna say they're amazing, but honestly, like, you can do so much with that tool in such a simple fashion. For example, right here, I'm importing this picture into Luminar and I'm using some of the accent slider, which is amazing to really get even more punch in your picture. Like, it's really amazing what you can do, but there are so many different options. You can replace skies, you can work with layers, and it's also a standalone software. So if you don't want to use Lightroom at all, then you can just take your picture into Luminar right away and edit it fully there. But I personally prefer to use it as plugin and just edit all of the stuff that I can do in Lightroom and then take it into Luminar and enhance it even further. You can get a 14-day free trial so you can try out everything, and if you don't like it, then you don't have to commit or pay anything at all. So yeah, definitely check it out, it's an amazing program. Now I know this has been very quick, very broad, and by the way, here's the raw file from before any of the editing, and here is afterwards. I think it looks a lot better, but I would definitely like to spend a bit more time to detail and fine adjust everything. But with that being said, I think this is where I'm gonna end this video, so thank you very much for watching and sticking around all the way till the end. If you would like to learn even more about Lightroom and photography, there are 2 more videos over there. But yeah, take care guys and have a wonderful day.